John McLaughlin, TV host who made combat of Punditry, dies at 89. John McLaughlin, a former Roman Catholic priest who became an aide to Richard M. Nixon in the White House and parlayed his fierce defense of the president into a television career as host of the McLaughlin Group, the long-running Sunday morning program of combative political punditry, died on Tuesday at his home in Washington. He was 89. His death was announced on the program's Facebook page. The columnist Eleanor Clift, a longtime panelist on the show, wrote in the Daily Beast that he had been treated for prostate cancer for some time and that it had spread. Mr. McLaughlin had been absent from the show this last weekend for the first time in more than 34 years. "I am under the weather," he wrote to viewers in a note that began the broadcast, adding that his voice was weaker than usual but that his spirit is strong. As creator, executive producer and host of the McLaughlin Group, which began in 1982, Mr. McLaughlin helped reinvent the political talk show format by injecting unabashed partisanship and a dash of entertainment. His program, broadcast on select CBS and PBS stations, inspired a generation of pundits, although few quite adopted his self-exaggerated, blustery persona. His penchant for giving nicknames to his panelists, his riffling through the week's topics and his prosecutorial questioning became fodder for comedians, notably Dana Carvey on Saturday Night Live, even while policymakers tuned in for the political observations. The show always ended with a prediction by each of the panelists, with Mr. McLaughlin getting the final word, even if seemingly with tongue-in-cheek. In 1989, for example, he predicted, "Within weeks, Delaware will authorize public flogging for drug trafficking." It did not. His trademark sign-off was a robust bye-bye. Mr. McLaughlin, who left the priesthood in 1975, proved that you could be provocative and an advocate and entertaining, and bring a larger audience to public affairs programming, said Tammy Haddad, a former vice president of political coverage for MSNBC. Ms. Haddad was also an executive producer of Hardball with Chris Matthews, whose host got ample exposure on Mr. McLaughlin's weekly roundtable earlier in his career. The early success of CNN, Ms. Haddad noted, was based on its political food fights by the likes of Robert Novak and Patrick J. Buchanan, both of whom were founding McLaughlin Group panelists. Continue reading the main story. Advertisement. Continue reading the main story. While in the White House, Mr. McLaughlin, well-informed but prone to tirades, would sometimes almost become a cartoon of himself when reporters called, said Bob Schieffer, the CBS News Washington reporter who became host of the CBS Sunday show Face the Nation. But as a talk show host, Mr. Schieffer said, Mr. McLaughlin changed the industry with his shouting. Combativeness was part of Mr. McLaughlin's style from the beginning. As a Jesuit priest, he had been in frequent conflict with his superiors, who disapproved of his 1970 run for the United States Senate in Rhode Island as a Republican calling for a rapid end to the Vietnam War. Father McLaughlin, who had resigned as an editor at the Jesuit magazine America and switched his party affiliation, was believed to be the first active Roman Catholic priest to run for the Senate. He stood in sharp contrast to his fellow Jesuit Robert Drinan of Massachusetts, who was given permission to run for the House that same year as an anti-war Democrat. Father McLaughlin, who was chastised by the Bishop of Providence, R.I., for his Senate run, lost by a wide margin to the incumbent Democrat, John O. Pastore. Father McLaughlin went to Washington anyway, joining President Nixon's speech-writing team in 1971. Nicknamed Nixon's priest, he gave frequent speeches in defense of the president's conduct of the Vietnam War, including bombing missions into Cambodia. As the Watergate crisis deepened, Father McLaughlin became one of the president's most visible supporters. At one news conference, he dismissed Nixon's use of profanity as emotional drainage. Less than 2 weeks before the president resigned, Father McLaughlin warned in a speech at the National Press Club that the nation would face a parade of horrors should Nixon be impeached. On July 31, 1973, Father Drinan became the first congressman to call for impeachment in a House resolution. After Vice President Gerald R. Ford succeeded Nixon in August 1974, Father McLaughlin's speechwriting position was abolished. Father McLaughlin had maintained a high profile in Washington, living at the Tony Watergate complex rather than in the austere Jesuit residence at Georgetown University where Father Drinan lived. This led his church superiors to rebuke him in May 1974, summoning him to a period of reflection. Instead, in 1975, Mr. McLaughlin successfully petitioned Pope Paul VI and was released from his vows. That same year he married Ann Dorr, his former Senate campaign manager. She later served as Secretary of Labor under President Ronald Reagan. The couple divorced in 1992. In 1997 he married Christina Vidal, the vice president for operations of Oliver Productions, the company that produces the McLaughlin Report. That marriage also ended in divorce. There was no immediate word on survivors. John Joseph McLaughlin was born in Providence on March 29, 1927, to the former Riveter Cott and Augustus H. McLaughlin, a regional salesman for a furniture company. After graduating from La Salle Academy in Providence and studying for the priesthood in Massachusetts, he was ordained a priest in 1947. He earned master's degrees in philosophy and English literature from Boston College, and a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University. He then taught at the Jesuit-run Fairfield College Preparatory School in Connecticut. After leaving the White House, he and his wife at the time, Miss Dorr, founded a media relations and public affairs consulting company. In the early 1980s, Mr. McLaughlin hosted a weekend talk program on the Washington radio station WRC. After a stint as the Washington editor and columnist for the weekly magazine National Review, he founded a television production concern with the backing of former Nixon allies and persuaded NBC's Washington television affiliate, WRC-TV, to broadcast a new type of weekend political talk show and to let him host it. At the time, TV roundtables of journalists like Agransky and Company and Washington Week in Review dissected the week's developments in a sober, nonpartisan style. Mr. McLaughlin envisioned a more animated, argumentative format including a panel reflecting conservative, moderate and liberal views, with him as moderator. From its debut in 1982 the McLaughlin Group took on the flavor of a barroom debate, pitting a largely white, male cadre of columnists and political insiders against one another as they gave vent to views from the hard right, Mr. Novak and Mr. Buchanan, to the center left, Morton Kondrak of the New Republic and Jack Gurmand of the Baltimore Sun. Miss Clift, a Newsweek correspondent at the time, and the Chicago Tribune columnist Clarence Page, who is black, later joined the group as more liberal regulars. Regardless of the panelists' political persuasions, Mr. McLaughlin, whose own politics leaned decidedly right, would often fire off questions and cut them off, shouting "Roan." When the cameras were off, the panelists often feuded. Mr. Novak left after a falling out in 1988 and founded a similar program on CNN, Capital Gang. In an interview on PBS in June 2007, Mr. Novak said of Mr. McLaughlin, "He may not be pure evil, but he's close to it." Mr. Gurmand, another of the original panelists, called the show really bad TV, and said he had stayed on only because he needed the money to pay his daughter's medical school tuition. Mr. McLaughlin was also the executive producer and host of John McLaughlin's One-on-One, a weekly interview program that was broadcast on NBC and PBS stations. From 1989 to 1994 he hosted a daily interview show on CNBC. In a 1992 profile in the Times, Mr. McLaughlin defended his style. "Does this depreciate journalism?" he asked. "Not one damn bit. Journalists can get very pompous, especially in the formalized days of Meet the Press, when they took themselves so damned seriously. This show demythologizes the press, and I think people like that." Continue reading the main story. What's next?